In the spring of 1652, the morning air in the foothills is unusually thin and carries a persistent chill, a lingering breath of the long winters that characterize this middle century of the Little Ice Age. The frost remains white and thick upon the sagebrush, and the ground, still hardened by the sub-zero nights of the Maunder minimum, does not yet yield to the weight of a moccasined foot. The sun rises as a pale, distant disk, casting long and low-intensity shadows across the rocky slopes where the parkland begins its transition into the western coniferous forests. In this quiet space, the only movement is the steady, rhythmic puff of breath from the man and his dogs, visible as small clouds of mist that dissipate slowly in the still, cold air. There is a profound silence in the forest, broken only by the occasional high-pitched chirp of a prairie dog, alert to the passing travelers, or the distant, muffled sound of a stream carrying the first melt of the high alpine glaciers. The man moves with a measured pace, his eyes tracing the vertical lines of the trees, looking for the specific straightness required for the bones of a new home. Beside him, the dogs move with tails low, their fur occasionally rimmed with a fine glaze of frost from the damp undergrowth they navigate. There is no rush in this journey. The selection of the wood is a task that occupies the full span of the morning, governed by the slow requirement of finding poles that are neither too heavy for the dogs to pull, nor too weak to stand against the western winds. The search concludes at a dense stand of lodgepole pine, where the trees grow in such close proximity that they have been forced to stretch upward, straight and slender, shedding their lower branches in the competition for light. These trees, known in the language of the people as standing people, possess a grain that is tight and resilient, capable of withstanding the immense pressure of a hide cover and the seasonal loads of heavy snow. The man approaches a single tree, his hand resting briefly on the rough, grayish-brown bark, feeling the cold texture of the wood beneath. He selects poles that are between 3 and 4 inches in diameter at the base, tapering to a fine point over the length of nearly 20 feet. Each choice is deliberate, ensuring the set of 15 to 20 poles will be uniform in weight and flexibility. Before the first strike, a small offering of tobacco is placed at the roots, a quiet acknowledgement of the life being taken and the service the tree will provide as a protector of the family. The scent of the forest at this moment is a complex layering of damp earth, the sharp, cold smell of pine needles, and the faint, sweet aroma of the sap beginning to stir deep within the trunk. The thought of the man is clear and slow. He considers the weight of the wood and the strength of the sinew he carries in his pouch. There is a calm certainty in the work, a recognition that the home begins here, in the shadow of the mountain and the stillness of the wood. The felling begins not with the ringing bite of modern steel, but with the dull, resonant thud of a stone celt and the sharp, short strokes of a French Biscay trade axe. The stone tool, a finely polished blade of basalt lashed to a wooden handle with wet sinew and reinforced with pine pitch, does not cut so much as it fractures the vertically oriented fibers of the wood. Each strike is short and precise, delivered at a steep angle to the stem, creating a rhythmic tuk, tuk, tuk that echoes softly through the trees. The iron trade axe, an egg-shaped head without a pole, is used for the finer work, its blade thin and capable of slicing through the sapwood where the stone tool might only crush. The man works with a steady cadence, his movements mimicking the slow, deep breathing of a long-distance traveler, never overexerting, allowing the weight of the tool to do the primary work. As the blade enters the wood, a fresh, citrusy scent of limonene and alpha-pinene is released, a bright contrast to the heavy, loamy smell of the forest floor. The wood is green and full of moisture, making each strike sound wet and heavy, a tactile vibration that travels up the handle and into the man's palms. Small chips of pale wood fall into the frost-covered grass, and the internal monologue of the man remains centered on the task. The tree must fall exactly where the ground is flat to avoid breaking the slender tip. The moment of failure is marked by a sudden, sharp crack, the sound of the heartwood finally giving way, followed by the long, rushing sigh of the branches passing through the air and the soft, muffled thud as the pole meets the earth. Once the tree is down, the long and repetitive process of stripping the bark begins, a task that requires a different kind of patience and a finer set of tools. Using a bone scraper fashioned from the leg bone of a bison or a smoothed piece of chert, the man begins to peel away the protective outer layer. The sound is a long, continuous hiss, a shh, shh, that follows the length of the pole as the tool slides beneath the bark and lifts it in long, curling strips. The inner surface of the bark is cool and slippery, coated in a sweet, mucilaginous substance that the people sometimes consume for nourishment in these lean spring months. As the bark is removed, the pale, wet heartwood is exposed, glistening with a thin film of sap that is incredibly sticky to the touch. The resin clings to the man's fingers like a thick glue, its scent becoming more intense, a heavy resinous odor that is both woody and sweet. He works from the base toward the tip, carefully removing every knot and branch stub with the iron hatchet until the surface is as smooth as a river stone. This smoothness is essential. It ensures that when the rains come, the water will flow down the pole to the ground rather than dripping into the center of the teepee. The sun has moved higher now, and its warmth begins to dry the surface of the wood, causing the sap to harden and the pale color to shift toward a light amber. The repetition of the scraping motion becomes a form of meditation, the rhythmic movement of the arm and the steady hiss of the bone on wood, creating a quiet sanctuary of work within the vastness of the foothills. The final task of the day is the assembly of the dog travail for the long journey back to the camp. 2 of the newly prepared poles are selected to form the A-frame, their tips lashed together with thick buffalo sinew that has been softened in water. The man wraps the apex of the frame in soft buffalo skin to protect the dog's shoulders from friction burns, securing the harness with leather straps that have been treated with fat to remain supple in the cold. The dogs stand patiently, their breath still misting, as the weight is distributed. A single dog can pull between 20 and 30 kilograms over the native grasslands. As the procession begins to move, the splayed ends of the poles drag across the prairie, making a nearly silent, sweeping sound as they pass over the dry grasses. This sound is unlike the cracking of a wheel. It is a soft, rhythmic shh, whisk that harmonizes with the jingle of the harness and the soft padding of the dog's paws on the earth. The travail floats over the uneven terrain,
the long poles providing leverage that allows the dogs to navigate gullies and slopes with a steady, unhurried gait. The man walks beside them, his hand occasionally resting on the load to steady it, his thoughts turning to the camp where the women will continue the work of seasoning and polishing the wood. The shadows are lengthening once more, and the air begins to sharpen with the coming frost of the evening. The poles, the first pieces of the new house, move slowly across the vast open horizon, a steady and unchanging flow of time under the endless sky.
The return to the winter-weary camp is marked by the low, rhythmic thumping of dog paws against the thawing earth of the early 1650s prairie. As the dogs draw the travois through the tall, dried grasses of the previous season, the splayed ends of the lodgepole pine poles leave shallow, parallel grooves in the soil, a temporary map of the family's movement across the foothills. The air in the camp carries a different weight than the forest, thick with the scent of smoldering buffalo dung and the faint, acrid tang of wood smoke that has settled into the very fibers of the hide lodges. The man leads the team toward a flat clearing on the edge of the circle, where the sun strikes the ground with a pale, unblinking intensity, its light lacking the warmth of late summer, but providing enough clarity to see the fine details of the work ahead. He moves with a quiet efficiency, unbuckling the rawhide harnesses and allowing the dogs to shake the frost and dust from their heavy coats. The poles are slid from the frames and laid side by side on a bed of dry sage, their fresh, pale wood contrasting sharply with the dark, weathered colors of the existing camp. There is no urgency in these movements. The seasoning of the wood is a dialogue between the tree and the wind that will take many days to complete. He rests his hand once more on a pole, feeling the cold, damp surface of the wood, knowing that the journey from standing person to the bone of the home has only just begun. In this transitional season of the Maunder minimum, the sap of the lodgepole pine is thick and viscous, acting as a slow-moving lifeblood that remains tacky to the touch long after the tree has been felled. As the man begins the secondary scraping, his fingers become coated in a layer of clear, golden resin that is both protean and aromatic, a substance that clings to the skin with the tenacity of glue. The texture is initially slick and cool, like a thick oil, but as the air works upon it, the resin becomes draggy and stiff, catching on the fine hairs of his hands and leaving a sweet, resinous scent that will remain for many days. He observes the way the sap bubbles slightly at the cut ends of the poles, a slow-motion exudation of terpenes, alpha-pinene and limonene, that fills the immediate workspace with a sharp, citrusy freshness. To manage the stickiness, he occasionally rubs his palms with a handful of fine, dry silt or the powdery white yeast found on the bark of nearby aspen trees, a repetitive gesture that turns the tacky resin into a dry, workable crust. The thought arises that this sap is the tree's own medicine, a protective barrier against the biting insects and fungal rot of the foothills.
and now it serves as the first layer of protection for the home. The stickiness is not an inconvenience, but a tactile confirmation of the wood's youth and strength, a granular detail in the long, unchanging flow of the spring afternoon. The man takes up a long, curved scraper fashioned from the rib of an old buffalo bull, its edges ground down on a river stone until they are as smooth and hard as glass. He seats himself on the ground, the length of a 20-foot pole resting across his lap, and begins the long, rhythmic task of removing the inner cambium layer. The sound of the bone against the green wood is a steady, rasping hiss, a whisk that repeats every 2 arm lengths, the cadence of the stroke mimicking the slow, deep breathing of a man at rest. As the bone edge bites into the wood, it lifts the final remnants of the inner bark in long, curling, translucent shavings that fall to the earth like pale ribbons. This inner layer, often sweet and moisture-rich in the spring, is scraped away until the heartwood is exposed, revealing a surface that is white, profane, and subtly dimpled. The resistance of the wood varies. Near the knots where branches once grew, the bone scraper must be angled more steeply, the sound shifting from a hiss to a low rhythmic thrum as it passes over the dense, swirled grain. He works from the butt toward the tip, his eyes following the edge of the tool as it reveals the hidden geometry of the tree. Each stroke is a lesson in the tree's history, a tactile exploration of the years of growth captured in the tight, cold rings of the 17th century forest. To ensure the poles are perfectly smooth, a necessity for directing rain away from the interior of the lodge, the man uses a handful of coarse sandstone gathered from the dry creek beds. The tactile sensation is of intense friction and heat as he rubs the stone against the lodgepole. The rough grit breaks down into a fine gray powder, filling the air with a faint mineral smell. The sound is a low-frequency grinding, a granular shh that vibrates through the wood and into his chest, a repetitive and hypnotic noise that masks the distant sounds of the camp. He focuses on the areas where the Biscay iron axe had trimmed away the branches, smoothing the stubs until they are flush with the trunk, ensuring there are no protrusions to catch the hide cover or create a dripping point for rainwater. The wood begins to lose its raw, fibrous look, taking on a polished sheen that reflects the low-intensity light of the sun. Under his touch, the pole becomes cool and sleek, the surface tension so low that a drop of water would slide down its length without interruption. He thinks of the rain that will surely come, the sudden spring storms of the Little Ice Age, and how these poles must shed the moisture to keep the children dry and warm beneath the buffalo skins. This smoothing is the final refinement of the bones, a task that bridges the gap between the wild forest and the domestic sanctuary. Without the use of graduated scales,
The man measures the poles against the only constants he knows, the reach of his own arms and the span of his hands. He stands at the base of a pole, extending his arms in a full cubit reach, marking the 20-foot length by the repetition of his own body's dimensions. He checks the diameter at the crossing point, ensuring it is no wider than 4 fingers, a thickness that allows for a tight, stable crossing at the apex of the teepee. The taper of the lodgepole is natural, but he verifies it by sliding his hand along the length, feeling the gradual narrowing from the 3-inch butt to the slender, flexible tip. These measurements are not technical, but personal, a way of ensuring the home is built to the scale of the humans who will inhabit it. He considers the balance of the 15 poles, selecting the 3 strongest for the foundation tripod, the ones that will bear the primary burden of the wind and the weight of the skins. Each pole is marked with a small notch near the tie point, a quiet preparation for the day when the family will raise the structure together. The thought is calm. The house is already present in the proportions of the wood, waiting only for the final curing and the lashing of the sinew to become a reality. The final processing requires the poles to be stood upright, leaning in a tight cluster against a sturdy tripod or the crotch of a high tree, where the air can circulate freely around each trunk. In this vertical position, the remaining moisture in the green wood begins to migrate, pulled downward by gravity and drawn outward by the dry, anticyclonic winds of the northern plains. Every morning, as the frost begins to melt into the soil, the man goes to the poles and gives each one a deliberate quarter turn. This repetitive action ensures that the sun's drying effect is distributed evenly, preventing the slender poles from warping or bowing under their own weight. The sound of the poles shifting against one another is a dry wooden clack, followed by a long, low creak as they settle into their new positions. Over the days, the pale white of the fresh pine begins to darken, shifting toward a light amber or a soft, weathered gray as the resin cures within the grain. The wood becomes harder and significantly lighter, losing the green weight that would have exhausted the dogs on a long march. He watches the shadows of the poles lengthen across the camp floor, a sundial of the season's progress, knowing that when the wood is dry enough to ring with a clear, sharp note when struck, the bones will be ready for the skin. There is no need to rise yet. The seasoning will take as long as the sky requires, and in this gray space between the work and the completion, he is content.